Father Alexander Rentel is Chancellor of the USCA and has taught canon law at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary for many years. Father Alexander is one of just a handful of Orthodox academics whose focus is on the canonical tradition of the Orthodox Church. I know there's a lot of interest in the canons and in the canonical tradition, and so I was really glad for the opportunity to sit down with Father Alexander recently. So without further ado, I hope you'll enjoy this episode from my interview with Father Alexander Rentel.
Ultimately, the tradition, the Orthodox canonical tradition and the Roman system of canon law derive from the same sources, late antiquity, conciliar activity, but very early on they kind of go off in different directions for historical reasons. Not one side became better and one side became nefarious. No, they just had very different reasons that they continued along their journey of how they developed. The Eastern Church maintained these system of using these canons, the corpus of canons, and interpreting them. The canonical tradition itself in the Eastern Church very much continues, even though the corpus can be said to be closed. It doesn't have to be that you can't add more canons, but none have really been added since, as I would imagine, the Phodian councils of the mid-9th century. More canons could be added, but none have been. In any event, more or less from that time of the close of the corpus, the church has continued to use these, reflect on these through the process of jurists, church jurists, canon lawyers, we might say, the activity of synods, consideration of new situations. That is to say, different countries that the church finds itself. It has to interact with the secular world, and things like statutes, bylaws, articles of incorporation. All of these things have a canonical feel to them, and in many ways very much our modern updates of the canonical tradition. So while the corpus is more or less closed, canonical activity continues down to this very day. Synods continue to meet. Great and Holy Synod met very recently in 2016. Certainly not all of the Orthodox churches went. Nevertheless, they promulgated 6 very important texts, a message and an encyclical, all of which reflect very accurately, in my estimation, much of the canonical tradition. And these texts have to be seen, I think, also within the legacy, the ongoing tradition, life of the canonical tradition. In the Roman Church, it's a little bit different. I don't know as well the early history, but of course the history of Western canon law took a little bit of a different turn than just continuing to ruminate on these earlier conciliar texts. You had papal decretals, you had the formation of canon law as an academic discipline in the early Bologna universities, in the University of Bologna, and this kind of ongoing reflection about how that was needed in the Western countries. In the modern world, though, almost all of this, what we have in the East, a system of precedents, almost a common law tradition of reflecting back on precedents, what had been done, what has the church done throughout its sojourn here on earth. The Roman Church has instead taken a very similar tradition to what we have, and replaced it with codes of canon law. And these are very fine works. These are done by the most eminent jurists and canonists in the Roman tradition. And I would say even further, parenthetically, that the work that was done in preparation for the drafting of these codes of canon law spurred on considerable academic activity and further reflection also in the Eastern Church, precisely with regard to the nature of canonical tradition, history, its sources. Even today, academic conferences are held by academic societies that were more or less started at the time of the recodification of the canon law in the Western and Eastern churches. Anyway, since the end of the 20th century, both the Western Roman Catholic Church and then the Eastern churches who are in communion with Rome have two different codes of canon law, both covering them. And in particular, they have done away with the precedents, the common law tradition, and their canonists work exclusively from these codes. They don't work from the canons and the conciliar activity of the past. They work from the codes as have been promulgated in, 40 years ago, beginning in the early 80s, and onwards with the Code of Western Canon Law. And I forget the exact dates for that. But it's a very different approach, a very, very different approach, because with a code, of course, it takes on much more of a different character than in the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, and I'm not trying to cast like a romantic, we have it so much better. In some ways, I wish we had more canonical discipline along the lines of what the Roman Church has. But where we would seek to apply exactly the canons and the canonical tradition to given problems in the Church using a wide range of sources, primarily the canons themselves, but also the entire discipline of theology, scripture, patristics, liturgy, spiritual tradition. The Romans would refer exactly to the code and seek to apply it in a very particular way. Now, I want to be sure to emphasize that these codes are exceptionally written, very well thought out, but it represents a very different methodology, a very different application of the tradition of the Church than what we have in the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox, but then also, of course, with regard to the Oriental Orthodox Church.
Hi again. Hope you enjoyed this episode from my interview with Father Alexander Rentel. Please subscribe to get notified when new videos become available. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of this channel. There's a link to the patronage page of our website below this video. Thanks so much for your support, and we'll see you soon.